feel like planning is a very pedantic process. I feel like it ultimately builds more flexibility into who you are and then what you're able to mentally adjust to as it comes up.
Welcome to Mindset Lessons from the Field. I'm Gina Kazazza, the author of the upcoming memoir, Training with a SEAL. Today's guest spent 10 years providing direct counterterrorism intelligence analyst for the United States Special Operations Forces. He is a paramedic who recently returned from his fourth trip to Ukraine, where he serves as the team lead and security specialist for Forza Ukraine, an organization that provides training in advanced pre-hospital trauma care. He was deployed to Afghanistan 5 times between 2004 and 2010, Iraq twice, and did his last deployment with Naval Special Warfare to Jordan in 2017. Ladies and gentlemen, I am excited to introduce Mike Piet to the show. Mike, thank you so much for being here.
Gina, thanks so much for having me on this morning. Really appreciate it.
Oh, I'm really excited to talk to you. So tell me, you are very interesting with all the stuff that you have going on. You're a paramedic, rescue diver, trauma medicine instructor. You're a paramedic. You served in the government. You worked for the government for 10 years, working alongside special forces. So tell me, what got you into this line of work?
Yeah, well, my dad worked for the government in a very different capacity. I ended up growing up overseas. I was born in Indonesia, so saw a lot of that work overseas. He worked for the United States Agency for International Development, a subset of the State Department now. And a lot of his work was based on health, particularly reproductive health and women's mortality, infant mortality. So I had a lot of that experience growing up. Grew up in Indonesia, Nepal, Bangladesh, Egypt, kind of all over the place. And that really developed this sense of interest in the rest of the world and adventure. I went to college, though, really wanting to be a marine biologist, and was actually doing that, helping a gentleman do his PhD research in marine biology in 1998 when the embassies were bombed in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. And as I watched the footage of that, I also watched Miami rescue team, Fairfax County's rescue team get deployed out, and they came out on the C-130 and they had their dogs and all their equipment. And I started to wonder what I was doing with my life. You know, we were sitting in a beautiful house in the Keys. We were doing this marine biology research, which necessitated scuba diving every day. And I did not see a future in it for me. And so when I went back to college, I ended up taking an initial EMT course, which I really enjoyed. Took me through a couple of years doing that. In North Carolina, where I was volunteering, you had to be an EMT to be part of the rescue team. And I really wanted to do swiftwater rescue. I wanted to do the rescue part of it, but you had to have your EMT cert. Ended up moving up to Virginia shortly after that. I knew that while EMS was interesting, like built into the name is that you're responding to a crisis that's already happened, right? We are first responders. And what bothered me was I wanted to get to the other side of the event. I wanted to be part of the apparatus that kept the event from happening in the first place. So started looking at graduate schools, but moved up to Virginia in this entire process and ended up getting into a graduate program, studying international security with a focus on counterterrorism, ironically there throughout September 11th. The other piece of that, though, is I'd gone to an interest meeting with Arlington County Fire on September 10th, that Monday night, where they were looking for new recruits, new volunteers, and basically asked what the opportunities were. And then come September 11th morning, I was living just a couple miles from the Pentagon. I happened to call Arlington Fire and said, do you need people? And they basically said, if you can get here, please come. So ended up spending most of that afternoon of September 11th all night with Arlington County Fire as part of the response to the Pentagon. Really kind of solidified what I wanted to do with my life, obviously get to the front side of that. But the emergency medicine piece really never left. Obviously, being in a graduate program for counterterrorism in DC on September 11th, I think all of my classmates were recruited either into the intelligence community or into law enforcement. And most of us spent a good part of our lives, if not a full career, doing that. But I never lost the interest in doing emergency medicine. So when I decided to leave the command in 2018, initially to go back to school to get into healthcare, I don't think it surprised anybody when I ended up becoming a paramedic instead.
That's really interesting. I want to go into childhood on where you said you really grew up in various parts of the world. How often were you in America throughout your childhood, and what did you learn from other cultures that you might use today, or that was ingrained or developed in you that you wouldn't have had you grown up fully in America?
Sure. So to answer your first question, we came back. My dad got a master's degree also at the University of North Carolina when I was 8. So we lived in North Carolina from the time I was 8 until 9, basically, before moving back overseas. And then, given where we were living at the time, Bangladesh, the high school was not fantastic. So I ended up coming back to the States and going to boarding school for the last 3 years. But that was really, I came back to the States permanently at 15, which is a weird age, especially if you think back to the 90s when the internet was not really a thing. And it's a challenging thing to talk about now because we feel that the world is very globally connected, and we are, and information passing and all that. The cultural connectivity that existed when I came back to high school was not the same. So I didn't have any of the same cultural references. I hadn't seen the same TV shows, didn't know the music. I'd basically grown up culturally in Asia for all of my life. And then all of a sudden, as you can see, I don't fit that role. Like, I look very American. So I didn't really fit in with the kids that I felt most comfortable with, but I also didn't fit in with the American kids because I didn't have any of that same cultural reference to go back to. As a 15-year-old, that's terrible. As an adult, I look back on that and I'm so grateful for that experience because at the very basic level, it made me extremely comfortable with traveling, right? Like, I know how airports work. I know how to get through customs. Like, I know all of those things that make my life now significantly more simplified. I can travel basically anywhere feeling very comfortable. I think the other and more important thing that it really drove home was this sense of curiosity about places and people and our differences. Um, and so much of what we look like on the outside is so incredibly superficial to who we are as people. And oftentimes, as you move across cultures, you realize the similarities far outweigh what makes us different. And what it what all that curiosity and growing up with countries with different predominant religions, different forms of government, different interests, different socioeconomics, what that has allowed me to do now when we travel, especially to places like Ukraine, is that you can relate to people in a different way. I've seen places where people have abject poverty as the norm, and so you can figure out how to relate to people who are completely different from you. And looking back on that experience growing up and all my experiences as a younger person on deployment, and we'll get into this later, all of that has fed into my comfort level with what I do now. And so when we talk about what we do and how we do it, it's all informed by those early years.
What were some similarities that you noticed when you were growing up, and what were some differences that you noticed growing up?
Similarities between, like, if I'd grown up
Between being an American and then the other countries that you grew up in.
Yeah, I mean, I think the similarities of growing up overseas compared to in the States, there are things that are critically important to development. And I was very involved in sports, for example, and sports were really what helped me assimilate when I got back to the States. Those things are really, really universal in terms of how you then relate to your home culture, which for me was the US. As a young person, so I'm going to date myself a little bit here. Like, the first year I lived in the States was the year that the Chicago Bears won the Super Bowl. And I became this like rabidly odd Chicago sports fan, despite having never lived there, only living on the East Coast. And so a lot of my sports heroes and sports idols were people like Walter Payton and Jim McMahon, and then ultimately people like Michael Jordan, all of whom played sports in Chicago. But there were ties back to North Carolina where we lived because of Jordan having gone to school there and stuff like that. Playing sports overseas, being on the basketball team, weirdly also playing sports that were more popular in overseas, like swimming and tennis and things like that. Didn't translate great when I got back to the States, but you understand those cultures of teams are universal. You understand those cultures of small groups of individuals, be that your community or your tribe or however you want to talk about those, are critically important. And one of the things that was really interesting in living in that overseas community is it's very transient. People are on different timelines with their assignments, be they with the State Department, with USAID, Peace Corps folks. So the friendships and the bonds that you make are extremely quick and extremely tight. And when I see, as we go through the career and when you go through bonding experiences like that and having time to go on, like for our school trips in the spring, we would go on a trek. So a multi-day hike into the woods or the mountains rather in Nepal. Bunch of like 7th and 8th graders with some faculty advisors. Like this was your school trip every spring. And I liken that so closely to the experiences that we had developmentally as I was kind of coming up through that community that I was tangential to. Like those close bonding experiences are so incredibly important. Obviously, I think I've spoken to some of the differences. Like you don't do that in the States, right?
Yeah.
Your school trips in the States are not 5 days in the mountains of Nepal.
No. I want to get into the fact that you talk a lot about teams and, you now lead teams through other countries. Like you've just led teams to your 4th trip through Ukraine. And it's like what you're doing is trauma. And I want to know like what going on these hikes and trips and stuff like that, like were there people that struggled throughout it? And if so, like how did you guys get through that as young 7th and 8th grade kids? And did any of this help you with now being a team leader in other foreign countries?
Yeah, I think as 7th and 8th graders, probably really poorly, because kids are mean, and kids, you are kind of merciless to the kids that are struggling, especially if it's easy for you. I think what was really interesting was I did that for 4 years when I lived in Nepal, and then when I moved to Bangladesh, which is at a lower altitude, I was there for my 9th grade year, and I ended up going back. We ended up again doing a school field trip to Nepal to go on a hike, and I was the one struggling. And because it was so different for me at that point, I'd lived a year at a different altitude. The obvious lesson is, at some point it's going to be hard for everybody, or something is going to be hard for everybody. As hard as it is to look back on those and go, man, I wish I was a lot nicer to that kid that was struggling at that point. It's also an opportunity to learn and grow. Like you're not expected to be a great leader at 13 or 14, but if you're still that same leader at 35 or 40, and you haven't done any sort of development as to who you can be, like that's the problem. And so learning those lessons early on about, hey, looking back on that, I'm not proud of the way that we handled some of these situations. I'm now committed to doing that better. Like I'm not going to be the bully. I'm not going to be the guy who berates or belittles people for what they can't do. And those were lessons that were really honed in my career. How do you bring people up who are maybe not very strong in a certain aspect, but are incredibly strong somewhere else? How do you vector in on that to help them develop a skill set that brings them strength across a lot of things, but starts at where they are? We don't expect people to start incredibly high. We have some incredibly gifted individuals, talented at very many things, but not everyone's there. And so how do you find the kid or the young person or now the adult who's extremely good here but struggles in other aspects and use this as their anchor point to develop them? And looking back, I see that started early on in those trips.
And what have you learned today that allows your team to be so successful in getting missions accomplished overseas?
The biggest thing is trust. We are very lucky that we get to pick who we work with, but everybody who comes to our team has an incredible skill set. I mean, our doctor is a dual board certified family medicine, emergency medicine doctor, plus he's a professor of emergency medicine. One of my paramedics has 12 years of experience, to include a year of combat experience as a 68 whiskey helicopter medic in Afghanistan. One of my other medics has 6 years of experience, predominantly in an urban system where there's a lot going on, a lot of trauma. So I've got fantastic people. But at the end of the day, with the exception of the one, they're civilians and for the most part don't have a lot of conflict or combat zone experience. They are still so good at what they do that I trust them to do what they're good at so that then I can focus on what I need to do, which is move them safely through a country, through an environment that they may not be comfortable with necessarily on their own. But, trusting your people, delegating things out, building people up, like I said just a second ago, like I've got a doctor who's fantastic. Like his skill set with medicine is one of the best I've ever seen, but he's not a pre-hospital provider. So how do we anchor what he's really good at, the medicine, the knowledge, the understanding of that, to also build him up to be able to teach what we need to teach, which are the pre-hospital aspects of the skills as well. The environment that's not well lit, it's not your ER. You don't have a full team around you. It's in the dirt, it's in a trench, it's in a small stabilization point in the field where there's shelling going on outside. So how do you let him anchor his skill set with what he knows in the medicine and then build him to where he needs to be an excellent also pre-hospital provider?
Now, how do you develop that trust or just build that trust with a new teammate that you don't know?
I mean, it sounds so incredibly basic, but it starts with listening. Most people need to be heard. Most people want to be heard. And most people, especially at this point in our careers and at this point in our lives, have a really interesting thing to tell you. Everyone can teach you something. And that was one of the other really important lessons that came out of my time with special operations, was that rank does matter to an extent, but what mattered more was expertise. And I likened it to a meritocracy. If you were the smartest person in the room on something, if you were the expert, it didn't matter how experienced you were, how senior you were, what your rank was. You were the expert. And everyone listened to you, whether that was your teammates, your peers, your colleagues, other ranking officers, and seeing that firsthand and understanding like everybody's got something. You can learn something from everybody. And again, where we talk about kind of anchoring is, what is that thing? What's that thing that you're passionate about? What's that thing that you can teach me so that you feel heard and you feel invested in what we're doing now?
That's really interesting. I've never thought of just listening to build trust and to hear each other out and to see what people are passionate about and really good at, to really understand and to trust another person on the team. That was it's so basic, yet it's true. I want to know, what have you, working alongside special forces, as you just mentioned, what do you find that they do better than everyone else?
Two things stand out immediately. One is that they focus on the basics. And we talk a lot about it. If I can't trust you to do the little thing right, I can't trust you to do the big thing right. And I've heard other guys talk about this, what differentiates kind of tier one special operations from everyone else. And a lot of the guys talk about how surprised they were when they first got there, that they basically stripped away everything and they restarted at the very, very basics. And guys talk about how, they were very good shooters, for example, but they relearned all of the basics of a fundamental skill. And the same thing is true here. We focus on the basics. The other thing that they do better than I think everybody else, and this is something we've tried to extrapolate and grow on, is that they plan. You look at what a plan for a special operations unit is, and we've got multiple pre-plans that we go through. We start to sub-select down what the best ones are going to be. We plan for every contingency. And that is something that I think, as we get deeper into this conversation, that's going to be an ongoing theme of how do you prepare for a lot of the things that you go into? Most people haven't seen emergencies. Most people haven't seen a lot of trauma. I haven't seen most of the scenarios that I planned for in Ukraine, but I still plan for them because at least I've put some thought into it so that when that moment comes, I'm not sitting there trying to rack my brain going, what should I do? So yeah, those two things really, really stand out when you look at special operations. They're incredibly good at the basics and they have their fundamentals down pat and they plan and plan and plan and they have every contingency covered.
It's funny that you say plan because even just in a family, I believe planning is so important. And growing up in my family, we were a family of 5. And even today, like getting together and going on vacation together, like we all have different interests. Right. We all have different dietary restrictions. And for me, I am a planner. My cousin and my mom and I went on a road trip. And then I went on a road trip with my friend and my mom as well. And each person got an itinerary for the trip. Yep. And it let us know like where we're going to go, where we're going to stop, what foods are around the area. And the thing is, everyone's like, you're such a planner. And I was like, they're like, what about spontaneous? And I go, hey, we can totally be spontaneous if we see something along the way or want us up here. But at least if we're not, we have a plan and a path that we're going. And they are always so confused by that. And I know with my family, like on holiday time, I'm like, let's plan the day. Let's plan out the restaurants we want to go to, the activities. And then nothing happens. And then all of a sudden, the day of the event or the day of just us getting together, by the time everyone wakes up, they're like, spend 3 hours trying to figure out what to do, where to eat. And I'm like, all this could have been done when, we planned into it. And I feel like just that alone can just help people in just life. Like my family laughs at me because I plan my outfit for the week, like on Sunday for Sunday. And I'm just like, well, then I don't have to think about it. Like, it's just, that's it. And I have a backup outfit. Like, they always have a plan and a plan and a plan. But I think that just the 2 basic things that you said was understanding and knowing the basics. And because any job that you go into, you should fundamentally always go back to those basics to just refresh and also understand the company or the people that you're working with on how they're doing things. And everything's, I think all skills are perishable if you're not using them properly. If you're not learning, if you're not listening and listening to people on a daily basis, you're going to quickly strip away your skill of listening if you stop doing it. So just those 2 things alone, I feel like, could help everyday people just navigate through life a little bit better.
Absolutely. And, in your story talking about road trip planning, one of the things that kind of differentiates us as a team when we go to Ukraine is that we have an ops plan for every movement that we're going to do. And within those movements, every waypoint is set out with where we're going to be stopping, how far away that is, what's available there in terms of food, sustenance, bathrooms, etc. It's a critical part of everything we do. I mean, and that's literally just getting in a car and moving from point A to point B. But without that planning aspect to it, I feel at least, our ability to flex gets compromised because if you then have to change and deviate, you don't have a baseline from what you were operating off initially. But 2, you haven't really considered any of those other options. And this last time in Ukraine, we had to make last minute changes almost on a daily basis. But if you don't have those foundations of, here's our plan, ideally we're sticking to this plan. If this doesn't work, here's contingency A, B, and C, and we're going to work through those in a stepwise manner, like we would have been dead in the water within a week of being in country this time. And so people feel like planning is a very pedantic process. I feel like it ultimately builds more flexibility into who you are and then what you're able to mentally adjust to as it comes up.
Yeah, I believe planning gives you a lot of flexibility. I think planning gives you a lot of freedom. Like
Mhm.
even planning your day and structuring your day out. Like I know the time I'm waking up and the time I'm going to bed every day. And I've noticed for myself, like my morning routine and evening routine are the same. But my day, I stopped planning my daily day because things just got a little hectic, and it makes me even more hectic. And I'm going back to the basics of planning because, like you mentioned a very important word, which is foundation. It gives you that foundation to then build and go off of. But without that foundation, it's just chaos. Do you in your day translate the planning to your life, like when you're going, like if you're taking a vacation or throughout your day, do you incorporate those things, or there's some things that you do in the field that now has become a part of you in civilian form?
Yeah, it's a little bit more challenging because of the schedule that we work. So the current shift schedule that I'm on for 48 hours straight, and then I'm off for 96 hours. So it's not like I have a week to plan around where it's like Monday through Friday, I'm going to be at work from this hour to this hour. It's kind of similar in many ways. Like that time that I'm at work feels a lot like deployment. And I'll flip back into, okay, I'm in my deployment mindset. What are the things that are important? Prioritizing sleep when I can, because in a 48-hour shift, I can be woken up all night like I was 2 days ago. Every single emergency call we came in happened between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. So, how do you plan a day around literally somebody else's emergencies for 48 hours straight? And that's where you really learn how to prioritize the things like self-care and how am I going to be as mentally acute at 4 o'clock in the morning as I would be at 10 o'clock in the morning. And so while I can't necessarily plan out a schedule, the things that are important to me are still captured within that day. I still prioritize sleep. I eat well when I can, admittedly, because we never know. But I prioritize, hey, I'm not on a call right now. What have I not done yet? I haven't slept. I'm going to sleep. If I haven't eaten, I'm going to eat. If I haven't worked out yet, I'm going to work out, because all of those things allow me to be where I need to be physically and mentally at hour 47 of a 48-hour shift. Now, on the days off, it's virtually the same. I still prioritize making sure that my sleep is good. I prioritize eating, but I can do it on my schedule. And so on my days off, it becomes a much more structured process of I'm going to eat, sleep, work out, be outside. Those are the things that I know keep me healthy. That structure stays in place. When I go to work or when we're on deployment, I know that flexes around, but the priorities remain the same. And so again, I plan for those in my day, knowing that I might have to have contingency plan A if we're just running constantly, contingency plan B of I've got a half an hour block. How do I make that work? So the two sides work hand in hand. And it all goes back to maybe not necessarily having a plan for my day, but having a plan for where I want my life to be and the things that I prioritize in my life. And so I fit those in where I can.
Now you talked about sleep, and I want to talk about this. First of
Mm.
all, for someone that, like you said, your emergencies the other day was all between 10 and 5. How are you able to just sleep? Like, it's like, it's time to go to sleep, or I need to take a nap to be on it for this. Like, how are you able to do that? And did you train your body to be able to sleep when it's supposed to be sleeping?
To an extent, yeah, sure. Again, I was on a pretty constant deployment cycle and we were working off hours. So our cycle of operations tended to be overnight, which is, a human normal sleep cycle. And so you did learn to sleep during the day and sleep when you could. I think for me, I've gotten to the point of what are my priorities right now? And when I can talk about myself, I'd love to be able to prioritize, my sleep because it is important. But there are certainly times on deployment where as a leader, you realize the care of my team is more important than my own personal interests right now. So while I'd love to be sleeping right now, we also have an ongoing missile threat. And my team, they're the ones that need to be able to function tomorrow when we go to train, when we're doing all that stuff. I can sacrifice a couple hours of personal comfort to ensure that I'm the one who has Overwatch so that they can sleep. So it's become more of a macro scale. I understand better now. I don't necessarily need to sleep on a consistent basis as much as I know, like, hey, my team's good right now. I will sleep at a later time when it's a little bit more convenient for everybody. Mm-hmm. Now, in my personal life, it's very different, right? I can prioritize myself, and that's great. But yeah, it's certainly one of those things that there's a balance to it. There's an ideal that I think we'd all love to hit. But then there's the reality of not just what are your priorities, but what are the things that you're responsible for that may impact what you want to do. And if I could just, when we talk about the other point I really want to make about planning is, as a team leader, one of the benefits of having a solid plan is that people trust you, and that's critically important. And that goes for this as well, right? Like, I've got a plan for if something happens, this is what my team is going to do, and this is what I'm going to do to take care of them. And I think if you have that all planned out, your team knows, and your team buys in, and they trust you. And that's a critically important piece of everything that we do.
Today's podcast episode is brought to you by my absolute favorite company. If you know me or seen videos or photos of me, then you know I always have one on my wrist. I absolutely adore this company. DiscoverOmnia.com. DiscoverOmnia.com is the world's first smart crystal bracelet. Every single bracelet is handmade in the USA using real, genuine crystals made on memory wire. Every bracelet is unisex, and they're also aromatherapy. The cool part is the black onyx charm that is on the bracelet. It scans to your cell phone, connecting you to their Wellness Hub Elevate. You can also access their Wellness Hub Elevate on your computer or tablet. You just have to sign into your account. The bracelet gives you a 12-month membership. It has over 200 pieces of self-care content, from motivational tips, meditations, breathing exercises on the theme of your bracelet, printable journals, and so much more. The content is ever growing. And that's not all. The bracelet also gives you lifetime access to their Elevate Together Club, which meets monthly via Zoom. Each month is themed to give you actionable takeaways to elevate your life. And with this podcast episode, you get 40% off your purchase order by using the code MindsetPodcast. Use that code MindsetPodcast for 40% off. Just go to DiscoverOmnia.com. DiscoverOmnia.com, code MindsetPodcast for 40% off. Get your bracelet today. You do a lot of trauma and stuff. Mm-hmm. Now we're talking about sleep and going to sleep and everything. Is there anything that really keeps you up at night, or was there an incident that, gives you nightmares or gave you nightmares that you recall?
I remember early on, there was a deployment in 2017 or 2007 rather, where something happened that was outside of our control. A couple of missiles came in, they hit a point right next to us, killed a young man from 10th Mountain, and then injured very badly the guy who was standing right next to him. And we had shrapnel come through our building, and I remember being utterly terrified after that. And I'd been on a number of deployments up to that point. There had been other close calls, but there was this feeling of a lack of control, right? Like, nothing you could have done other than be standing in a different place at a different point in time would have saved you from that outcome. What I look at now in terms of what helps me, especially in my job, as we go through trauma, other people's trauma especially, there are a couple things. One, I've kind of had to accept that we don't control the outcome all the time. Unfortunately, I've had more patients die despite my best efforts than I've saved because of my interventions. That's just the truth of physiology and bad injury sometimes. What helps me get through that is, did I do everything to the best of my ability? Are my basics, are my foundations good enough? Am I so confident in the basics that I've done all of the things correctly? The injury was just unsurvivable. And so there's this aspect of, again, what allows me to sleep well at night is that I prepare as best I can. I have my basics, down. I have my foundations down. I have those guiding principles of what we do. I know my medicine. And if I do all of those things and the outcome is still bad, I have to accept that it's not necessarily because of anything that we did. And you can't necessarily own those outcomes at the end of the day. That's what I have seen drive people away from this, drive people to not be able to sleep. I should have done something different. I should have done more. Either then, why didn't you? Like, where were your foundations? Or it wasn't a thing you could change. And both of those things are critically important to understand.
Was there ever a day or an incident where you could have changed?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think early in my career, especially as a paramedic, you look back on some of the calls and you realize like your foundations weren't quite there yet. Because as much as we train and as many things as you go through in preparation, a real world emergency is totally different. And I'm sure when you talk to special operators, they'll tell you the first time they run a real firefight, it's not like training anymore. Like, aspects of your training kick in, but you look back on it and you go, wow, I should have done things differently. Or I wish I'd reacted in a certain way faster. I think one of the truisms that comes out of special operations or professional sports or people who are operating at the very top of their game, regardless of what they do, this idea of flow state, but also the idea that things, when you have more experience, when you have seen more things and gone through more repetition, and again, we're going to keep coming back to this idea of mental planning, like everything else slows down and you can work through those algorithms in a not just a stepwise fashion, but almost in parallel. And I was thinking about this. We just had a really, really horrific trauma. And I went back and I thought through I went back through my thought process throughout the whole thing. And I realized that as I was doing one thing, my mind was already kind of working through what had to not just happen next, but why we couldn't do a bunch of these things that possibly could have been interventions based on the nature of the injury. 3 years ago, when I started as a paramedic, there's no way you have that ability to have both of those things flowing in parallel. That comes with experience. That comes with mental preparation, because we don't necessarily always see each event that we're ultimately going, or we don't necessarily have the distinct experience to prepare us specifically for the event we're going to see. The only way you get through that is by thinking through it and thinking through this scenario and then thinking through this next scenario. And so, yeah, I think 3 years ago, if I could go back and be the paramedic I am now, there are choices I would have made that would be different.
It's interesting that you mentioned flow state, because one of our episodes we had Diego Ugaldi, and he talks about how when flow state versus muscle memory, he mentioned, when you're a SEAL, you're breaking everything down, you're doing it so many times, it's now just muscle memory, but that is not flow state. And
Right.
flow state is that optimal level. So tell us your experience with flow state, how you get into that flow state and stay in that flow state throughout something that could easily pull you out because you're dealing with trauma.
Sure. I'll actually give you an example that just happened in Ukraine, because this was we're already so we were in the very eastern part of Ukraine, really close to where a lot of the fighting is happening. You can hear artillery. It's a fairly constant part of our day. We're also training medics who have been on the front and are about to go back to the front. So not only are we having our own experiences, we're also hearing about theirs. And if you know anything about the war in Ukraine, the war on the front it's the most horrific thing I've ever been around or seen or been part of. the losses, the types of injuries, the stories that people tell are they're highly traumatic. So as the team lead, like we're already operating in that environment. I'm trying to navigate my team safely through this. We happen to go to a place in this eastern part where we ended up living in a team safe house where we had no electricity, we had no water, everything had been stripped out. It had been occupied by the Russians at the beginning of the invasion, so the entire house had been stripped of everything. So we're basically using a fire in a fireplace to stay warm 24 hours a day. We're having to stoke it. And so we have all of these things going on. And then we're doing training outside in the cold all day long. And so people are exhausted. And we were supposed to have this particular group until Friday. On Thursday, they came to us and they said, hey, we're going to have to cancel training tomorrow. We have our marching orders. We're leaving tonight for the front. And so then you have that emotional feeling of like, some of these guys are not going to come back. That's just the reality of the war. And shortly after we heard that, somebody came running into our house and said, hey, there's a house on fire about 100 yards from here. And for context, the village we were staying in, dense pine forest, all the houses are made of wood, and you could just see this kind of going domino fashion all the way to where we were staying. Now, this was a contingency that we had not specifically planned for. Fully engulfed house fire 100 yards away from us. But the thing that we were able to do, and then the other part of it was they didn't want to go near it because they thought there were still explosives in the house, and there was kind of unknown things in the house. But because we had all of these other plans, we were pretty able quickly to flex to, all right, we're going to adopt our emergency blowout procedure, which we already had established. I assigned our doctor and two of our interpreters who have really good medical experience to set up a casualty collection point, just in case anyone got burned or blown up or hit by shrapnel or anything like that. We had one person assigned as a lookout, basically to work as a conduit just outside the house. And then me and a teammate flexed outside, fully tactical gear, because at that point you could already hear the house. There were rounds starting to fire off in the house. A second house had caught on fire, but we still needed to evacuate the nearby area. And so part of what allowed us to just kind of work through that, both individually for me as a team lead, but also as a team, where I felt like we were in flow state. And 2 hours later, we got back to the house. We'd evacuated everything that needed to happen. The evacuation point had been set up. Our own gear was packed and ready to go if we'd had to blow out. That 2 hour window, we were all in flow state because we, one, had a plan, a clearly delineated plan of, hey, this is what I need you to do, and these are the steps I need you to take. Everyone had a role and responsibility that they were able to just immediately snap into. There was no like, oh, what should I do? Which is a clear detriment to flow state. And then there was trust internally within our team that was developed over time of, hey, if something bad happens, and again, this was a bad thing out of left field, something we'd never thought about, never planned for. But if something bad happens, one, we have a plan. Two, everyone's got a role and responsibility. Three, not to sound like that guy, but there is somebody in charge who knows what they're doing and expects these things from you. And then we were just able to work through that as a team and then come back together 2 hours later. Everything had been done. And we all kind of look around like our house is completely stripped, no personal gear in it, just a casualty collection point. Everything outside is taken care of. The fire's out. And we all come back and we're like, huh. But it's an example of how with clear delineation of responsibilities, with a clear plan, you can snap people into flow state, even in an event that comes kind of out of nowhere.
Wow, that's really interesting story, by the way. And again, I guess it really goes down to that basics. It goes down to the basics of everything that allows you to operate at that high level and get things done, especially in emergencies. Now, how can someone who's never experienced an emergency can train and be ready or just be able to jump into that action like, you know, they're driving a car or someone is driving the car and they're having their passenger or the driver is having a heart attack, or
Mhm.
they're at home and some emergency happens with a member of the family and they have to spring into action to help save them. How can someone be calm and relax? And I remember for myself, two incidents with my dad where I remember my mom, she used to be a hairdresser. So she was cutting his hair right before we were going on a trip. And when he like, I guess like leaned down so she could cut the back, he would pass out. He was passing out. And my mom was like, "Oh my God, look, we're about to go on a plane. Like, call 911 just to make sure like he passed out twice."
Mm.
So I remember like going outside, like having to make this call, and I'm already a very fast talker if you haven't figured it out by now. And so now with this emergency happening, I am now like I am on speed, like when I'm communicating, and yet I'm outside pacing because that's what I do. And so I'm grounding myself by like giving myself an action by pacing. And I'm also doing my best to breathe while communicating what's going on. But I don't really know what's going on aside from the fact that he's passed out, or he then came back, like he passed out twice, like came back. And they were like, okay, like slow down, calm down. And I'm like, I feel like I'm calm, but clearly I'm not calm. And then my insides is kind of panicking. And then a year ago, my dad, again with him, he was throwing up and having these like had a fever and all this stuff. And I'm like, you should go to the hospital. We bring him to urgent care. Next thing you know, they're bringing an ambulance and, he has to go through emergency surgery. And I felt like I was as calm as I could be. I was like, I kind of jump into like the reality sinks in. Like these could be my last moments of seeing my dad as
Mm.
he's going into the ambulance. So I'm like taking photos and my mom's like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "These could be our last moments. Mentally take it now." And she was like, "Oh my God." And I'm like, "Well, that's just reality." But at the same time, like I am still like doing my best to stay calm, but on the inside, you are kind of freaking out. And so what do you have and what advice like because I know the situation's going to arise again. Like it's going to
Yeah.
happen at some point. So what can one do to be better at preparing and staying calm?
Yeah, to a large extent, know your reaction in that situation is unique to you as an individual. So I think having a little bit of grace for yourself as a person to be like, hey, this was scary for me. Like that feeling afterwards of like, I feel very unsettled.
Yes. Yeah,
I,
it's
I
very
think,
unsettling. Yeah.
yeah. And I think accepting that as like, hey, this did not feel good to me. Um, Giving yourself that grace is a huge part of preparing yourself for the next time. I think that's critically important. Um, Understanding like, hey, this is the way that makes me feel. And it doesn't necessarily, as you just explained, the way you felt and the way you reacted didn't make any sense to your mom, right? Like, why are you doing this? It's what's right for me. And when we talk about post trauma, there is no right answer. It's how does it feel to you, and then how do you work through those feelings? When we talk about in the moment, and you talked about this yourself, you gave yourself a role. And when we come on scene and there's family or people who are there, one of the best things we can do is make them part of the process. I need you to do this. And even if it's something very basic, just giving people some sense of ownership over what's happening, some sense of buy-in is critically important. Like for you, you knew like I have to pace, I have to kind of get rid of some of this excess energy. And if you think back to the story I just told, there's really no difference. What was happening to us in Ukraine, fire right outside, you could hear stuff going on, a lot of commotion. That is an unsettling event. Having to actually say, hey, we're going to use our evac plan. I need you to execute this right now. That's an incredibly unsettling event across the team. by giving them all a role. Hey, once you get this done, this is the next thing I need you to focus on. That allowed them to move through that event because they didn't really have to think about what was concerning them or happening. They just had to focus on, this is what I'm tasked to do right now. And I'm going to get through this task because my team is counting on me, or your father's counting on you, or somebody else is counting on you. And I'm going to execute it to the best of my ability. Our doc has a great thing that he talks about, and he says, I will give you my best. And it's kind of an open-ended concept because you have to expect that his best on any given day may not be this extremely high standard that you may have for him, but it's the best he's got. And that's a really important thing to think about when we deal with emergencies or we deal with trauma, is that if people give you their best, understand their internal concerns about it, man, you're getting a lot out of folks. I think in terms of how we prepare for these things, I will say, generally speaking, and this is a kind of gross overgeneralization, but when I see a lot of folks in what we do, they are unprepared for what we would kind of consider the natural progression of life. I think we've become a little bit too sanitized to the fact that, death and emergencies and end of life care are part of lives. And I think a lot of that goes to the quality of the American healthcare system. Like we can save people who, keep people alive for perpetuity, basically. And I think it's kind of sheltered a lot of us. And so, one of the things that I have done personally is I've had those hard conversations with my parents. What is your expectation for end of life care? What's your expectation if this happens? Where is your do not resuscitate? Oh, it's upstairs in the safe. Like, please have that next to your bed in case the fire department comes in and there's a critical thing happening. So, one of the things that I have always found incredibly important, obviously we keep going back to preparation, is mentally preparing ourselves for the environment we're in. Like, now that your dad seems to have kind of some positional asphyxia and he'll pass out when his head goes down.
But like you said, though, it's like, to understand we're aging every single day, every single person from birth, you're aging. And it's just a natural progression. And you're right. Like, I know, like, talking to my family, like, I talk about death because I know that it's coming. So it's my way of also understanding and preparing for that moment, even though there's really no preparing in a sense of like, when it's coming or how it's happening. However, like, I remember sitting down, we had a family 60th dinner, and there was just like my aunt, my uncle, my parents. Yeah. And I said this to my mom because I feel like she's the only one I could really say this to. And I was like sitting that dinner thinking, like, in 5 years, one of us might not be here. And I said, high chance I'll still be here, but you three. And my mom was like, oh my God. And I'm just like, no, I'm like, you don't think like that? And she's like, no. And then I was like, and then I have an aunt that, like, you can't even bring up like death or, trauma or anything like that. It's like, God forbid. And it's like, no, but like, I mean, that's just natural. Like, I think to be able to talk about it is kind of crucial and important to just be and live in reality. And we get too comfortable living outside of reality that, like you just mentioned, we're so sheltered.
The continuing theme throughout this is obviously planning. And I think one of the things that, like, I'm an only child. So the thought of losing a parent, and I'm almost 50, and the fact that my parents are still alive is an incredible thing. And the fact that we're still a nuclear family and close and all of those things. Nothing will prepare me for the actual death of one of my parents. However, by having these conversations, by knowing what they want, what they're doing for me is the same thing I do for my team, the same thing I do for myself. They're providing me a plan of, hey, in the event that this happens, these are the things I want done. Because as we know, when that happens, our mind is not going to be on like, oh, I need a plan. Like, what would dad have wanted? I know what dad wants. And I know that my only responsibility at that point is to execute that plan. And that's what helps us get through even these horribly tragic events, is this idea that I've thought about it. I know that we've talked about it. I know that there's a plan in place so that when that huge emotional thing that I can't deal with happens in the moment, I can still go through the administrative pieces of like, okay, I know this needs to get done. Now this gets done. Now this gets done. And these are what the things that he wanted. I would argue one of the greatest gifts parents can give their children is that freedom of like, hey, here's my plan. This is what I would like you to do in the event of my demise, not in the event, at the time of my demise. And I've seen it happen both ways. My mom had one parent that had no plan at all, and one parent who saw that and was like, here's what I would like.
Saw that and was like, no, we're gonna go the opposite direction.
Yeah. Let me tell you which one was emotionally the same, both a huge loss, but all of the other things that make that challenging were stripped away by having a plan. Like,
like you said, you're executing. You're just like I give myself pacing to be able to accomplish whatever, because to ground those emotions, I give myself an action to ground the emotions and a task. Now, what do you do or have you experienced where you mentioned family, where you're in an emergency situation and you're seeing, and you give the family something? Was there ever a time where a family member was just like absolutely hysterical, and how did you calm them down or get them back to being grounded? How long did that take? Do you have a story for us in that situation?
Oof. Yeah. I mean, any kind of trauma involving a child, death of a child, like the emotions in that are, it's the most understandably extreme expression of emotion I've ever been a part of, with what we do. Pretty early in my career, we had a young person, a teenager, involved in a very bad ATV accident. Hit an on an ATV, hit a truck at high speed, and went into the front of the truck. Didn't have any protective equipment on. Mortal injuries. Like, this again is one of those things where, despite everything we were going to do for this patient, there was no chance he was surviving these injuries. There was none. The internal damage was too severe. He happened to be riding with his dad when it happened. And then somehow, still unbeknownst to me, his mom got on scene as we were doing things, and she literally came around the fire truck, which we had kind of blocked. We had tried to block all of the access points. She came around the fire truck and she saw her kid. And she had the exact emotion that you would expect, right? This hysterical, like, I can shut my eyes and hear her scream, and I will probably till the day I die. That is such a feeling of hopelessness at that point, because you know that there's nothing you're going to do to save this kid. But you've also got this expectation that you're there, like you're seen as this entity that could do something. Ultimately, as hard and as terrible as it is, being incredibly honest and incredibly direct with family, explaining the situation in terms that may make you feel super uncomfortable and incredibly nauseous. Like, I don't want to tell this parent that this is the injury that their child has had. But then in many ways, like we were talking about earlier, however they react is right. That's what is natural for them. That's their feeling in the moment. And sometimes, as the person providing that news, it doesn't make sense to you. Sometimes, honestly, like, you wish it would stop. The screaming and like that horrible emotional response as you're standing there. But you have to accept that the way people react in those situations is it's almost uncontrollable. And you just, as the person who's, again, good on their basics, good with a plan, willing to stand there and answer those hard questions, willing to stand there and absorb that emotion and let them get all of those things out and have good answers for them and have the right answer for them. One of the best things that we did in when I first went through paramedic school, and then as I was doing my internship, the first company that hired me, one of the best things they did, we spent about a week on death notification and how to do it right. And having that incredibly challenging but critical conversation with people and how to communicate that appropriately, using terms that people understand, not leaving any gray area with it. But it's hard. It's horrible. I think you could ask any casualty assistance officer a similar question. How does it feel to knock on the door and give the worst news possible? Hey, your kid's dead. How do you do that in a way that brings the family? There's no comfort in it, right? There's no way you can tell the mom, like, hey, here's the worst news you're ever going to hear. Here I am to comfort you. But again, not to beat a dead horse, but it all goes back to, what's your plan? Because like with trauma, there are a lot of things I can do to make that situation worse. There are a couple things I can do to try and make it better. And, telling a parent that their child is deceased due to injury, traumatic injury that's ugly and horrible. There are a lot of ways you can make that worse, but there's a way to do it right. If you don't have a plan on how you're going to do that, well, it's bad. It's real bad. And so again, I mean, just like our hard skills, the things that we do, that muscle memory piece that you talked about, forming the neural pathways to have a good understanding of those soft skills of how to talk to a parent, of going through that information with them, of allowing them to grieve however they need to in the moment. That all takes a plan too.
How do you handle your emotions when you are on a scene that is so horrific like that, or having to deliver news like that? And I feel like it's relatable to every single person who is going to go through or has been through a traumatic time in their life. How do you deal with and handle those emotions to be able to execute and get what you need to get done?
Yeah, so I don't want to say that I'm the lucky one in that situation, but I have a job, right? Like, my role in that particular scenario is very clear. Like, that is what I do my job for, is to be on those situations and to do my job to the best of my abilities. So in many ways, again, I defer to the themes of our conversations. I know that my basics are solid, and from the basics, I've built a foundation, which I then can do the advanced skills from. I practice, and then in the moment, I execute my plan. And that plan is always shifting based on mental models that I've built of, okay, I've thought through, this is our basic care algorithm, for example, for massive hemorrhage. We're going to do these things. If any of these other things come up in that process, I'm going to work through contingency A, B, C. So in many ways, my life is distilled down in those situations to, these are the actions that I have to take. These are the things that I know are going to help my patient. These are the things that I know are going to hurt my patient, so I don't do those. But for me in the moment, that's where I want to be. Just like if you talk to, I'm sure, in these special operations folks that you've talked to, they want to be in that moment where the training comes in, where all of the things that they planned for, prepared for, and now you're in that moment. That's why I do this job. Like, I love my job because I get to be in moments like that. But I love my job because I've prepared for moments like that. Like, if I hadn't prepared and I get thrown into that moment, I do not like this job. Like, that is terrible.
Yeah, that's traumatic. Like you said, like, I could close my eyes and hear that woman scream. There are things that give you nightmares that you can't unsee. And without that training, do you do like any breathing exercises or anything internally to get you to execute? Like, if, like you said, seeing a child dead before your eyes, knowing there's nothing you can do, is there anything internally or any exercises that you do for yourself to get you into it?
Ironically, when we're going into something and we have a very finite amount of information. And that's one of the other things I love about this job. And it was honed again in special operations. Like, you've got all these possibilities, you have a specific event, and within that event, you have very little information. And I've never been on target, but I liken it to kind of going out on a mission for a specific objective, and we don't really know what we're walking into. And it's very similar in emergency medicine. Going into a call, we are taking the limited amount of information that we have and making our contingency plans. We might have 5 minutes in transit from the time we get that call. Mentally, we're starting to go through, this is the most likely scenario. These are other possibilities. If these things happen, this is what we're going to do. And so we use every single minute of our time going into something, preparing to do our job. And I think that's, again, it's critically important. Even if you have 30 seconds, looking into your mental matrix and going, I have a solution that might work. Even if it doesn't work, it looks close enough.
It's funny that you're saying this, though, because I'm not a mom, but I have a nephew and he is 2. And when we do things, I am always mentally going through the checklist of, okay, like if we go out and he gets wet because he's spilled something on him, or there just happens to be a water fountain that he's just going to run in, do we have, this? Okay, if he's having a tantrum, what's going on here? How long are we going to be able to stay at this restaurant for? Is there an exit plan for, my mom eats very slow compared to everybody else. If like if he's having a meltdown, what are we going to do? And we're not one of those, let's put a phone in front of you. So I'm always thinking, okay, so what exercise, like game that we can do with him or toy that we can have. So I'm kind of going through it. And I feel like anyone that's listening, that's a parent, because for that week that I happen to have him, like, this is what I'm going through. I feel like it's the same thing. And that allows you to not have a breakdown or emotional reaction that's negative to when the child is going through whatever they're going through that you're not preparing for or can prepare for, like a meltdown over something because the kid is 2 and doesn't understand emotions and stuff like that. Instead of you reacting to it, it's like, I have the steps in place. I'm ready to go. And I think after talking to you more and more, I'm realizing that allows you to be emotionally, take that emotion out of it. You're able to, and I didn't really understand it at all until I'm realizing this conversation, because I keep pulling out, like doing my best to pull out of like, all right, internally though, we're freaking out. What can we do for emotional breathing exercise or this and that? And I'm realizing like just having that plan keeps you grounded to allow you to pull through to get to the end goal without allowing your emotions to go into reaction mode. Because especially with a child and within a family, I mean, you react, the family brings out the worst in you. So it's like knowing that you're having that plan allows you to not react and not allow the worst to come out of you, but allow the best, and you operate at your best. So I feel like that was like a big light bulb moment for me throughout this entire conversation, because that's a bit of a game changer.
Yeah, and I think the other important thing is we may not have the mental models for everything that we run into, obviously, but by having some sort of plan, you also have that anchor point that I said was so important. And off an anchor point, you can build another plan relatively quickly. It's when you're stuck in this point of like, I have no idea what to do, and I have no idea how I'm going to get through this. That's where you start to get stuck in this sense of like despair and hopelessness. And that's when the mind just starts to run. But I go back to what you were saying with when you had to make that phone call and you called the ambulance, like you gave yourself a task, and that's your anchor point, right? Like, I can do this. I know, even if I don't know anything else, I know that if I walk around, I'm going to dissipate some of this energy. Here's my anchor point. And from there, I can make the next decision and the next decision and the next decision. And it all tends to, we kind of talked about flow state, and that's really where it's at. Like, where do I start that allows me that anchor to go through the next few things that I have to do? there's nothing really magical about it. It's just kind of understanding like, here's where I am. This is where I need to go. I have a point in my mind somewhere. This looks familiar based on previous experience, based on something else I've seen, based on something I've mentally prepared for. Emergency. Okay, I'm going to break the emergency plan out right now. It's a fire. Didn't see that coming. All right. But the time before we were in Ukraine, we spent 2 hours outside sheltering from a cruise missile attack, only to come back to a massive storm that tore our tent apart in the middle of the night. And so you're like, okay, what do I need to do to execute to get my team out of this tent into a safe place, save the gear that we can? It's like, yeah, I did not see typhoon coming through Ukraine on my bingo card for this trip. But do you have an emergency plan? And when that emergency happens, do you have a point of reference to go back and say, okay, I'm going to start here and then I'm going to build?
So what would you say as our wrap-up question that I ask everybody?
Mm-hmm.
What can we do on an everyday basis to develop mental toughness, to strengthen ourselves for the tough moments that are inevitably going to come, all the storms that happen in our lives, or to tap into some untapped potential that we're not reaching? What do you got for us?
I don't think my answer is going to be a surprise. Regardless of what you do, be really good at the basics. Whether that's if you're a janitor who's cleaning the bathrooms at your local gas station, like be really, really good at the basics. We see it all the time in the special operations community. You start with the basics. If you can't do the small things right, you cannot do the big things right because it's all foundational. And the other thing, obviously, be willing to make a plan. And when we go through our daily lives, we think about all the things that we go through, and it kind of also helps break us out of this monotony of like, I'm going to wake up, I'm going to go to the office, and I'm going to commute home. I think through all the contingencies, whether that's this street's going to be closed on my way to work, how am I going to get there that's going to be different? Or if I see a traffic accident right in front of me, what am I going to do? It kind of allows you, one, to kind of break up the thought process, like, hey, I'm going to think through some different options here. But two, when that moment comes, my parents are older. What am I going to do when this happens? Even if I've never had a specific rep on that exact scenario, I've at least got a mental model that I can fall back on. And we talk about this a lot in Ukraine. Like, and some of my teammates are like, you're very pessimistic about things. I'm like, I'm not pessimistic. I'm preparing for the worst case scenarios that if and when that happens, I've already got that on the shelf. And I don't have to then go, oh no, like we need a plan right now for this worst case scenario because I never thought about it. The other thing that allows me to do, and I think this is also important because I don't want to get stuck in that OODA loop of fear. I have a plan. I'm comfortable with that worst case scenario plan, and I put it on the shelf. I don't keep rehashing it. I don't keep like shooting holes in it. Worst case scenario plans are for worst case scenario, right? Like you don't assume that they're going to happen every day. So you don't need to keep going back to it. But I do have that idea in mind of if that happens, I already have a plan for that. And I'm going to go through that plan because I've already thought it through. I've already developed it and I've put it on the shelf. So to summarize, yeah, I mean, you go to the real, be excellent at the basics. Don't just be good at them. Be excellent at your basics and have plans.
It's funny because Coach Mac, the Navy SEAL I trained with, he used to always say, if you think you're too good for the basics, it means you need to go back to the basics. Because we all hit that point where we think we've conquered those basics, and then you realize that's when it's time you need to go back to the basics every single time. It's something you're gonna keep kind of circling around. And I really enjoyed, I feel like a lot of our listeners are really gonna get a lot out of what you talked about. And I know I definitely want my family to listen to it, especially on the plan part. Maybe next Christmas we'll we'll actually come out with the plan and they'll see how flawless it gets executed. But thanks for being here, Mike. I really enjoyed talking with you, and I'm just grateful to have you on the show.
Yeah, this was great. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone that's listening. Please go like, share, comment, subscribe, become a Patreon member, so you get extra bonus goodies that only our Patreon members get. Tune in next week for our next episode.